Hey, welcome back to Engine Shop Joe. It's just about the end of the year. The old goes out, the new comes in. I wanted to do a little reminiscing and talk about something that's coming to an end this year, and that is in February of 2024, Cummins released a technical service bulletin stating that once their supply of Select Plus or Select ecms is exhausted, they will no longer be available. The Select Plus, you can upgrade the engine for about $11,000 in parts, just parts, so that it will run the same ECM that's basically on the ISX CM870. You can still buy those ECMs, the Select and Select Plus, online, generically on eBay. Whether or not they're any good, don't know, couldn't tell you. But you'll no longer be able to get them from Cummins. So that's kind of the spear through the old N14 heart, if you will. So tonight we want to take a look at a little quickly at those ECMs and do a little reminiscing, and you're going to learn at least one thing I'll bet you didn't know, maybe two. Okay, here we go. So up on the top left, that's what the typical exploded view of a Select Plus or a Select ECM plug looked like. The main difference in those plugs was just the shell on the right, because it had key marks in it that prevented you from plugging the wrong plug into the wrong port. So if you went in and ground all the markers out of the ECM or the stops out of the housing, you could plug any of those plugs into any holes. The end of the plug where the wires butted up is where there was grooves cut in it that allowed it to mate to they look like little triangles in the ECM. If you look over on the right, those yellow arrows are pointing to those little triangles, and they were in different places in each port, so you couldn't plug the plug in correctly. That thing that looks like a Swiss cheese in the middle on the left over there, that was simply something to hold the pin in alignment so it wouldn't break off. If you take a look down at the pin, that long gold pin, that was a pretty fragile pin. And where those two red arrows are, that's the part of the pin where there was press fit, where it grabbed and you had your contact area. And I used to repair those for people with needle nose. If they had no pin drag, I'd pull that pin out, and as long as none of those legs were cracked, I would just squeeze that in with needle nose pliers back and forth, and then check the pin drag, and it was good. I'd put the pin back in, and that saved them about $7.50 that they never knew I saved them. Over on the top right was a typical bench loading plug you could buy from the factory. Interesting note of trivia, when they first came out with ECMs, I would actually bench load ECMs by just taking the pin you see on the bottom left and pushing it on the terminals and using a bunch of alligator clips that I soldered on wires. I had a battery there, and I had a data port that came out of, it was called the inline at the time, the simple communicator, and we just jumped wires like that, and it worked. And then we got a little fancier, and we got a PCB electrical workbox. It was about a foot cube, and I put some switches in it, and we bought those ends from the factory, and we made them up at our branch because everybody and their brother was bringing ECMs to us, all the dealers, when they found out that we could program them. This is back in 1993, 94, 91. And then a guy from the factory came out and he saw our plugs, which were pretty primitive looking but worked. And then he went back, and they would come out from the factory off and on. And he went back, and about a year later, you could buy a nice kit from the factory that had all these plugs in it for all the ECMs. How about that? Talk about coincidences in life. Okay, let's look down at the chart. You see where there's a C and a B. So right under that ECM, it says ECMB will be defined as Select. That was the first generation. And then it says ECMC will be defined as Select Plus. And that was the second generation. And C would be the Select Plus part numbers. You had 308, 4473, 309, 6662, and 340, 8300. 6662 was the cheapest, 4473 was the next most expensive, and the 8300 was the most expensive. Way many years later, I found out that the difference between those three ECMs was 3 parts. The cheapest parts were in the 6662, and then when they would repair those, the parts that failed the most often would be higher grade repair parts. That was the 4473, and then the 8300 had some kind of a big torrid coil that was a much better coil that they put in. So I was told. Other than that, the ECMs, those 3 ECMs were interchangeable. Now you say, was that the same deal on the B, or down where the blue B is? Those are the part numbers of the Select ECMs, which were the first generation. No, it was not the same. The part number differences on the Select ECM were there because with the electronic ECM, that's where they started controlling fan clutches. And you just had a solenoid that sent air to the fan clutch, or you turned it off. Well, with the Select ECM, you could not change the logic. So the 9037 was one logic where when you needed the fan to come on, it would send power to the solenoid. And the 8046 was the other logic where when you needed the fan come on, it would take power off. And you couldn't go in and flip the logic and the parameters like you could in the Select Plus. And then the 8303 was a Select ECM that I believe that's the one they use for more off-road. And there were some other pins that the software could do different things with. So that was the scoop on the ECMs. And Select was first generation, Plus was second generation. Select was pretty stable, Plus got a little flaky because of the way they did the signaling. On the Select ECM, you actually had when you flip the voltage, like in the cab, let's say you flip the voltage for cruise, you would send voltage to the cruise pin, and that would turn it on. On the Select Plus ECM, they started grounding float voltages to turn things on and using operational amplifiers inside the ECM. Because they were quicker, better, they were more versatile when they wanted to do things. But when they started doing that, now the ECM became very sensitive to stray grounds. Whereas Select ECM didn't really care if the ground wasn't too good. The Select Plus, if you had the ECM case ungrounded for some reason, you had crazy stuff going on and all kinds of faults. So that's why you would see that little screw that had the star washer under it in the one corner to make sure that you had a good ground to that aluminum case. Now here's a little more trivia. And this is kind of a not so good picture, but on the Select Plus, on the later years of it, I'm going to say the last few years it was made, they added a fuse like you see up in the insert there with the orange wires. They added a fuse right where that yellow arrow is, and it hung down on the back there. And one lead went to a screw that held the ECM on the engine. And then the other lead went into the harness. And we discovered that if that fuse was blown, you would have problems with switches not doing their functions, not acting correctly, and the engine sometimes would buck or kick or misfire or pop and then run fine. And, be trying to figure out what's going on. So a guy comes up to me and goes, hey, if the engine's running weird like this, pull that cap and put a new fuse in it. It's probably blown. So I pulled the cap off. Sure enough, the fuse is blown. I put a new fuse in and started up. It runs great. So we're all thinking, well, that was pretty dumb of Cummins to put a fuse there. And then the light came on, and I realized that that fuse was a tattletale that told you that the ECM had lost ground to the cooling plate, or the cooling plate that it bolted to had lost ground to the cylinder block, or the block had lost ground to the battery ground. And the wire that went off of that fuse into the harness was tied right into the wires that went to the ground lug on the batteries, so that you were sure that you had a good ground. So that was your little trivia, that that fuse was a tattletale fuse and not what some people call a ground or running fuse. And the other bit of trivia that maybe you didn't know was that the Select ECMs had to be purchased by part number to match your fan logic, whereas the Select Plus, you could adjust fan logic in the parameters. The last thing I'll say is that the Select ECMs were extremely easy to program because you just flip the switch on for ignition and program it, and it goes. The Select Plus, you had a key on for about a second and a half, and then you had a key off. And then the ECM would go to sleep in 5 seconds, and then you would click your mouse to start sending the calibration. And if you did it in that order, it would go. If you tried to calibrate a blank Select Plus with a key on, it would never calibrate. Once it was calibrated, it behaved like a Select Plus, and you'd calibrate it with the key on. Thanks for joining me on Engine Shop Joe for a blast to the past.